Let's get it started. On behalf of the VTA and Minority Business Consortium and SVTC, we welcome you to this month's BART Silicon Valley Phase 2 Mentor Protege Workshop. This is the 7th of our workshop series. I'm Raul Labrin, Vice President with WSP and SVTC's Mentor Protege Plan Lead. I'm joined today by Minority Business Consortium representatives Reginald Swilley and Carol Beam. As mentioned, today's presentation is the 7th workshop, and it covers the topic of impacts of climate change, transitioning to a sustainable and resilient business model. Our two presenters are leaders within WSP's Climate, Resilience, and Sustainability. We call it CRS National Business Line. Note that today's presentation is being recorded, and a copy will be made available on a website that will be provided in the chat function. All of our 6 presentations to date are available, and this one will be made available shortly after the presentation. As mentioned, take some time to introduce yourself in the chat function. We are proposing to, or we won't have, what we're going to do is Q&A after the presentation, but if you feel that you have a question during the presentation, don't hesitate to raise a hand, and we can allow you to ask a question. The presenters are fine with that. The presentation is expected to run 30 to 35 minutes, again, allowing time for Q&A. And we're looking forward to hearing from our presenters. Before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to Reginald Swilley from NBC to say a few words. Reggie?
Thanks, Raul. The Minority Business Consortium is glad to be leading this charge with VTA and the BART Silicon Valley Phase 2 project. We have been really working hard to help prepare many of the small businesses in the area to be impacted by this BART Phase 2. SVTC is a great partner. Raul has been doing great work. We want to hear from you. If you have some questions, if you have some issues that you'd like for us to address, or some other topics even, or just to say how wonderful these workshops have been, give us a call, send us an email, and we will respond to you. Raul is giving us, let you know that all of these workshops are recorded. They are on diversitybusinessforum.com. There is a link to VTA at the Office of Budget, the Office of Business Diversity Program. And we want you to know that all of this information is being laid out so that you can be better prepared to bring value to this BART Phase 2 project. We thank our presenters, and we thank Minority Business Consortium. I'm partnered with Walter Wilson, and we have been pushing this Mentor Protege program because we are trying to build up the climate for the small DBE companies in the Bay Area. So we hope you enjoy this presentation, and we're glad to be doing the work to bring it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. And now on to the presentation. Today's presenters are Emily Wasley and Sue Kemball-Cook. Emily is a nationally recognized climate change adaptation and resilience professional, passionate about empowering everyone to thrive in the face of uncertainty. Emily serves as WSP USA's practice lead for corporate climate risk, adaptation, and resilience with over 17 years of demonstrated experience, convening diverse whole community members to understand, assess, and co-design solutions to address climate change in the context of all hazards. Dr. Sue Kemball-Cook is a senior project director at WSP. Sue's background is in physics and climate science, and her work at WSP focuses on helping companies understand and address their risks and opportunity from climate change. I'd also like to note that both Emily and Sue are based in the Bay Area, and we're happy to have them today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Emily, to get us going.
Excellent. Thank you, Raul. So we're just going to start with, Raul just gave some really nice introductions of who Sue and I are, but we are based in San Francisco, California, so local to the Bay Area. And we sit on the Climate Resilience and Sustainability National Business Line for WSP, which is an infrastructure engineering design company that you probably already know about. So today we're going to go through some key drivers of why companies now are starting to explore sustainability, why they're starting to explore environmental and social governance, or ESG, and how climate change is starting to affect companies. We're going to talk about some key trends that we're seeing in the marketplace, and then talk a little bit about what WSP has done to become more climate ready. So Carol, I'm going to turn over to you to start the poll questions, if you will. So the first question being, is climate change affecting your work? And the results are coming up. Great, so it's looking as though, yes, climate change is certainly affecting your work and may continue to. Okay, looks like we have as many as we can participating. I'm gonna go to the next poll question. I don't know if you're saying something, Carol, but you might be. We can always move on to the
Yeah,
slide.
I'm having a problem getting the next poll up. So let me see if I can do it and start the next one. And it's not letting me. Okay, let's see. Poll. We got that. We got the shared results. I'm sorry, you're going to have to ask your questions without getting that answer.
That's okay. But it sounds like from what we got in terms of responses that yes, climate change is affecting your work now. For most people, it's about 71% of responders said yes. So the other two questions that we were going to ask were, are your clients asking you about climate-related services? And has your company discussed how to become climate ready? So keep those in mind. That's kind of what we're going to address through our presentation today. And if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will try to address those as best we can throughout the presentation. So first, we're going to go through some key drivers. So climate change has been driving a lot of this increase in terms of interest from investors, interest from regulators, interest from companies, mostly because of the increase in physical impacts from climate change and extreme weather events. So we are seeing that there are more frequent and intense events happening as a driver of human-caused climate change. So that in itself has been affecting companies' supply chains or their operations or their people or their bottom line. And so with that, there are several other drivers. So investors are starting to be very much more interested in how companies are addressing climate change, how they're reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, but also how they're preparing for the risks associated with climate change, whether that be physical risks or the risks from transitioning to a low carbon economy. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And regulators, so different countries around the world are now mandating that companies disclose climate change risks and opportunities publicly so that country governments or regulators can understand how to price those risks. Also in the United States and here in California, the state government, the national government, the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, SEC, will be coming out with guidance, likely mandating over the next 2 years that companies disclose publicly how climate change affects their organization, how it affects their business strategy, and how it affects their financial bottom line. So with all of these challenges and drivers also come opportunities. So we're seeing a lot of companies now moving towards offering more sustainable services or products, enhancing the sustainability of their supply chains, which includes multiple different companies that either are subs to prime companies or are in their supply chain or value chain. and just new opportunities around creating a more sustainable and resilient future. So Larry Fink is one of the key people and organizations within BlackRock that has been driving a lot of this discussion. He says climate change has become a defining factor in a company's long-term prospects. He has publicly encouraged all of the companies that he invests in as BlackRock to align with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. So we'll get into that a little bit further in this discussion. Before we do that, there is a whole ecosystem of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, frameworks and standards and rating agencies and principles. And a lot of times it's very hard to navigate this space. And this is what WSP does well. We do this for our clients. We help them navigate which frameworks they should align to and why, identify what topics within the ESG context are material to them. So is it carbon emissions because you own and operate a high emitting company or facility? Or is it diversity and inclusion and justice and equity because you have an impact in a local community that you want to be more intentional about? So we help navigate this space, and we align as a company, we align with the UN Global Compact, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as well as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So Sue and I really focus most primarily on in our day-to-day job, helping companies understand their risks associated with climate change, the risks associated with transitioning to a low carbon economy, and what are the opportunities to become more sustainable and resilient. So that is where the TCFD comes in, and that's why we've highlighted that in red. So as I mentioned before, the market is increasingly heading towards regulatory mandates for climate change disclosure. So if you haven't already thought about it, now's the time. There are companies that are already out in front. There are companies that you can learn from, that you can partner with to do this work with. But mostly if you are a publicly traded company, and your investors are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, you're probably well advanced and aware of this process. But if you're a smaller business and you don't have the resources or don't know where to start, you can partner with companies like WSP or others that are in this group that may have been along the trajectory a little bit farther. So some investors are requesting that these climate disclosures be public. As well as regulators. I mentioned the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier. The White House has a new executive order on climate-related financial disclosures, and they are really looking at their supply chain. I spoke with the Government Services Administration, GSA, the other day, and now they're coming out with a climate risk scorecard to really score companies on how climate ready are they. And they'll be using public disclosures to assess that. So if you're a vendor that supplies or services or products to the federal government or even state and local governments, you'll want to be prepared for how they may assess you in terms of how climate ready are you. I won't go into the different countries, but a lot of different countries around the world are now mandating climate risk disclosures be public for companies of any size. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sue, who's going to dive into the TCFD.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to give you an overview of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so TCFD, and then sort of show what that process of coming to align with the TCFD framework might look like. So after the 2008 financial crisis, the G20 countries convened a financial stability board to look for systemic risks to the world's financial system. And one of the things they identified was climate change. So they formed a task force that looked at climate change and its potential impact on the world financial system. And they came to the conclusion that climate change is actually a threat to the financial system, with a magnitude of trillions of dollars of potential risk. And the problem is that people who are investing in companies want to know where those climate risks are so that they can allocate their assets and not lose them because they invested in a company that had a tremendous amount of climate risk. So the idea was to put together a framework that would help investors understand where climate risks are across companies. And since 2017, when the TCFD put out its guidance, there's been a tremendous amount of uptake around the world. You can see this map showing that more than 2,000 companies around the world now support this framework and disclose under it. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that they produced a framework. So in 2017, the TCFD, led by Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney, who's the director of the Bank of England at the time, put out this framework. And so this tells you what the framework is and how to align to it. So this is a framework under which companies can disclose their climate risks. And for now, doing this is voluntary. But as Emily said, there's a strong likelihood that the SEC is going to mandate some kind of disclosure in this area soon, and that the framework will look something like this. So the idea of this TCFD framework is it's designed to help companies look forward. So typically when companies are assessing their risks, they're basing their assessment on sort of what's happened in the recent past or what's likely to happen maybe in a 1 to 3 year window looking forward. And so the idea with climate change is you actually have to look further into the future for that to see what's coming down the road for your company in terms of, for example, if you're designing a building that has a lifetime of 30 years, you want to think about what the climate will look like at the end of that 30-year period so that you can adapt to any climate risks that might be coming down the road. The TCFD focuses a lot on the risks from the transition to the low carbon economy. As the world moves toward that low carbon economy, as we think about reducing carbon emissions to reduce those physical impacts from climate change, that's going to transform the economy. So you think about the power grid, think about cars, there's going to be this tremendous change in the economy. And so the idea is to help companies think about what that looks like for them and how that might look under different scenarios of future change. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the framework now. So there are 4 basic elements that the TCFD asks companies to disclose. The first is, what does the company's governance look like around climate-related risks and opportunities? So how is the company setting up to understand and evaluate its risks and what its future looks like related to climate change? What sort of strategies are they developing to evaluate those risks and to plan for them? How are they doing the identifying and managing the risks and opportunities that climate change will bring? And finally, what sort of metrics and targets are they setting to deal with it? So things like greenhouse gas emissions targets, water targets, waste targets, these kinds of things. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 basic areas, and you can see they're repeated again across the top. The TCFD asks for 11 specific disclosures. So under governance, disclosing potentially in a written report or ESG report, how the board oversees climate-related responsibilities, and then how information gets brought to the board by management, how management identifies climate risks and brings them upward for consideration by the board, and then how the board makes decisions based on that information. In terms of strategy, how is the company looking at the short, medium, long-term risks and opportunities from climate change? And then how does that information get into the business planning process? How is it informing business continuity? How is it informing risk management? Really thinking about how the organization's strategies for the future will fare under different potential climate change scenarios. And then thinking about risk management, the processes by which the company is looking at climate risks alongside all of its other risks. And so really the goal here under TCFD is for climate to be treated just as a company treats the rest of its risks that might be potentially material. To have climate evaluated alongside like weather, cyber risks, and all the other kinds of things that a company has to manage in an equivalent way. And then finally, disclosing all the different metrics and targets, so scope 1, 2 emissions, for example, and other metrics may be related to adaptation or waste or water. Next slide. Go ahead.
I'd like to launch this poll. The question is relevant to what you just said. which is, has your organization discussed or have plans on how to be climate ready? So if you all would answer that, it kind of reflects exactly to what these recommendations are.
Nice timing.
And Carol, you asked a good question about, is there funding for small businesses to become climate ready? I believe that there are state-funded grants to do this, especially in California, but yeah, there's still a big need to identify financing for the small or medium-sized businesses, because this is no small feat, but it can be done for small organizations. We've worked with NGOs, we've worked with other small organizations to really think about strategically what it is that they want to achieve, kind of what's their vision for a more sustainable and resilient climate and future for them as a business, and then work backwards from there. So it may look daunting, but it is doable. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from others that have gone through this process.
So that's interesting. So it's almost an even split. I mean, that's close to an even split. That's excellent.
40, 60, 40 have said yes, 40% have said yes, and about 60% have said no. So this is timely for all of you.
Great. I think, Emily, could you skip ahead 2 slides, actually? Let's go just, there you go. So I want, since we're talking about sort of companies' different levels of planning and readiness, just wanted to say that that kind of sort of difference among different companies in their current thinking about climate change is not unusual. We have clients who come to us in all different sort of levels of readiness for climate change. And so really, like, one of the core parts of our approach is to just really meet companies where they are. Because, I mean, you have to start from somewhere. And so typically what we'll do first is sit down with a company and say, kind of, where are you in terms of your planning? You know, are you thinking about climate change in terms of your risk management program? Are you talking about this at your board meetings regularly? If so, how regularly? So we do sort of a gap analysis, and then say, here's where you align with TCFD, and here's where, you know, you have some opportunities to work on your alignment. We'll often benchmark companies against their peers, because we find that there's a big difference across sectors, like with some sectors being much further along in this kind of alignment with TCFD. So for example, financial services companies really sort of are leading the way in many ways on this. But other sectors, you know, it's sort of just bubbling to the surface now. So there's a really broad range. And so then, you know, once we have that information about where the company is based on sort of interviews with their stakeholders, looking at their disclosures, then we can sort of map out a roadmap to say, okay, here's what you need to do to align with that framework, and just, you know, put very concrete goals. And then it's no longer sort of an unmanageable and nebulous problem. It's a specific actions you can take. And often the first step there is to take a look at what your actual risks are. So what I'm going to do, Emily, now could you go back to the previous slide? So what kinds of risks are you talking about if you're talking about climate risks? I think the ones that people maybe think of first are sort of physical risks, which are over here listed under acute and chronic. And so physical risks are things like impacts from hurricanes, wildfires, and so forth. And so we split them into 2 types: acute, which is things that are event driven. So like a wildfire impacts your facility, or sea level rise, or I'm sorry, storm surge affects a coastal plant that you have. Chronic risks are things that happen more slowly, and these tend to be much more difficult for companies to get their arms around in terms of their planning. These are things like sea level rise, and then slow changes in temperature that might do things like affect the efficiency of equipment in a plant, for example, or a power generation. So these are sort of the physical risks. And then the risks from their transition to the low carbon economy are listed above. And so this is things like policy and legal changes, so legislation around greenhouse gases, for example, or changes in technology that disrupt an industry. You could have changes in your market where consumers, for example, might have a preference for a more climate-friendly product, and reputational risks, for example, for companies that might have a large exposure to oil and gas or, you know, carbon-intensive industries. And so these are the kinds of risks Climate change can also bring opportunities. And in fact, we work with a lot of companies whose opportunities far outweigh their risks. So I think this is often good news for companies that they don't expect when we do this kind of analysis. But sort of thinking about resource efficiency and the sourcing of energy, the products and services and how those might change, sort of the development of low carbon products and low carbon services, and ways in which companies can increase their resilience to climate change. These are all opportunities. And so the idea is to gather these risks and opportunities together and then integrate them into the strategic planning process and understand their financial impacts. So that's really what this is all about, is understanding what these risks are and then quantifying them. Like, are they big enough that they're a material risk that needs to be disclosed to investors? Next slide, please, Emily. Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to talk about some trends. So just in thinking about the kinds of things that might be on the horizon that a company might need to think about. So when you think about buildings and infrastructure, in the past, they've been designed using historical data. So assuming that the past was going to continue into the future. So you think about a building and you only look at the floodplain data based on past rainstorms, for example. But the climate's changing. And so now you might find buildings facing unexpected challenges like this octopus here, which is lying on the floor of a Florida parking garage. And this happened on a perfectly sunny day. This is just an unusually high tide happened. And when the drainage pipes in this building were designed, they were safely above the high water mark. But the sea level has been rising. And so now when you get an unusually high tide, those drain pipes are partially submerged. And so that's how the octopus made its way inside. And so really this points to the need to, when you're planning now, not to just look at the past, but to actually understand what's going to happen in terms of climate change for the future. So designing a facility near the bay, you'd want to be thinking about sea level rise, for example. You'd want to be thinking about beefing up drainage to cope with potentially heavier extreme rainfall events in the future. Thinking about energy efficiency to reduce that carbon imprint, and thinking about resilient building standards. So fortified is one of the examples of this. So shifting the focus from building based on backward-looking data to including forward-looking data as well. Next slide. And so, of course, another example that's important here in California is like when you're thinking about development at the wildland-urban interface, thinking about potential impacts of future wildfire. I already talked about sea level rise and coastal projects. And especially for developments in brownfields. So thinking about remediation measures that exist and how changes in things like sea level rise and rising water tables or heavier rainfall events and drought might compromise the integrity of those remediation measures. Next slide, please. And so fortunately, there's a lot of information out there to get a handle on physical risk, especially in California. We are so lucky to have this website called CalAdapt, which is the one at the bottom. So this is a way where you can easily go online and find out what's going to happen at your particular location. Like they give you a map and you can click on the map and it will tell you about wildfire risk in the future. It'll tell you about extreme temperature, extreme rainfall, sea level rise. They've made it really user-friendly. So that's often a really good place to start if you're concerned about a particular location, just to go there and start looking around and see what you see. And sort of outside California, there are other resources as well from the US National Climate Assessment. This is from the last one. I just want to make a quick shout out to Emily, who's participating in developing the next US climate assessment. And of course, the IPCC has just released a new report talking about global climate change. So this is all sort of the latest science, but I would say if you're going to start with the CalAdapt webpage. That's a great place to go. Next slide, please. And so, you know, when you're thinking about your facilities, I mean, it's also critical to sort of think about the surrounding community as well when you're thinking about climate change, because of course no facility is an island. We're all dependent on the community and infrastructure around us. This slide shows Lower Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy, and you can see that, you know, the hurricane has caused massive power outages and most buildings are dark, except for that one, which is an investment bank that had a resilient electricity supply. And so they're, you know, lit up like a beacon. But the problem was that none of their staff could get to work because it was completely flooded. And so this, instead of becoming like a, you know, business continuity measure that was helpful, was actually sort of a millstone around their neck because it really sort of highlighted the divide between the haves and have-nots. And they could have, like, use that islanded power to help the community that was really under pressure at that time. So I think, a couple things here, like thinking about resilience is key. And also, thinking about the community that you work in and the ties to that community so that you can develop resilience together. And also considering equity in all climate adaptation measures, and really just thinking about climate in terms of that transition that is just for all. Next slide, please. Okay, so we think, looking ahead, that RFPs from the government are going to have more frequent integration of climate, so that it will be increasingly important for companies to understand their own resilience, their own climate exposures, and that sort of thinking about sustainability, being a resilient vendor in a sort of a meaningful way that shows that you've really done your homework will be a differentiator. It seems like maybe construction space companies are more focused on hazards, but our feeling is that by focusing on sustainability with our clients, it causes you to really sort of understand their business better and understand where they're coming from and what their goals are. And so that focus on holistic sustainability and resilience can really strengthen that client relationship. I think, next slide, please. Okay, so Emily, maybe I'll toss it back to you now.
That works. Okay, so now we're going to dive into a little bit more detail of behind the scenes of what we at WSP have been working on to make ourselves more sustainable and resilient. So a couple of just accolades that we do respond to the CDP questionnaire. If you're not familiar with CDP, it's formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's a questionnaire that you may be asked if you're a supplier to a larger organization or a government entity to respond to. It can be super onerous, so if you haven't already looked through it, just look through a couple of the questions that they ask and see if those are questions that you might be able to start to answer. We were named the most sustainable company in the engineering industry by World Finance Magazine. We became a signatory of the UN Global Compact in 2019. We also have signed a sustainable or sustainability linked credit term for the Americas. So that means that our loan and credit is dependent upon us achieving our sustainability goals. And we have 3 goals, one of which is to become net zero. The second being to have more females in management and leadership positions. And then I'm forgetting the third one, but it is linked to sustainability. So that is a huge driver for our company to be investing in our own sustainability and leveraging the experts within our own company to really help us become more sustainable and resilient. We have become aligned with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We are still on that journey. It takes between 3 to 5 years to really be fully aligned with the TCFD. So if you're working with a company and they say, oh, it took us 6 months to be TCFD aligned, that's a red flag right there. But we also are one of the first transformational level organizational members of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. This is a group of professionals that work in the adaptation space at various different organizations and entities around the United States, and is really kind of an inclusive and collaborative space for people who are getting into the adaptation world to ask questions, to share information, to share data. And so we think very highly of that organization. I'm the president, so I'm a little bit biased, but we have a lot of members on our team that are also members of ASAP. And up here on the right, we committed to net zero. We set a science-based GHG greenhouse gas emission reduction target. This happened this past April. And this was a big commitment for us to make, but these are other commitments that you're probably seeing other companies make. And there are always roadmaps and feasibility studies behind that to make sure that there is a pathway to achieve that target. All right, so our journey has been lengthy. We started in 2009 Sue and I started at WSP more recently. I've been here for almost 2 years, Sue, almost a year. And so this predates us joining the team, but this was one of the drivers why I wanted to come work for WSP, because they have been committed to sustainability and resilience for a long time. So they started off with a greenhouse gas inventory to see kind of what's the footprint of our employees, of our offices around the world, because WSP is WSP USA, which is where Raul, Sue, and I work, is part of a broader WSP Global. So this is the WSP Global journey. So we have about 500,000 employees across the world. So we have a pretty significant footprint, but we also have, a pretty significant opportunity to provide more sustainable and resilient services to our clients. In 2010, we then first responded to the CDP climate change questionnaire. We then conducted a materiality assessment to identify what were the key environmental, social, and governance, ESG, topics that were most relevant to us as a company. So that we did in alignment with the Global Reporting Index, GRI. That is one of the standards that we mentioned at the beginning. Then with all that information, we were able to spend a couple of years setting a greenhouse gas target. This was before the Science-Based Target Initiative was formed. So we set a GHG target based on what we knew our footprint was and where we wanted to go in the future. After that, we then revised our materiality assessment in alignment with GRI again. And then we formed in 2019 a sustainability task force. So this brought together folks that from across the company, across the world, to really think about more strategically, where do we want to be as a business in the future and where is the market heading? We started engaging different rating agencies like MSCI, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and others to see how we could align with different metrics that they were looking at to understand how sustainable we are as a business. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we formed the Sustainability Linked Loan in 2019, which has been one of the first infrastructure companies to do so. So that we were really proud of. In 2020, that's when Sue and I started. Around that time, we launched into going from sustainability perspective to looking at resilience. So that's when we started getting into the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, looking at that framework. We did our own gap analysis, our own benchmarking. We formed a roadmap based on discussions with the C-suite and our board. We updated our sustainability policy. We did a environmental social governance benchmarking exercise. And then we started responding to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index's DJSI questionnaire. In 2021, we were even more active and we started a qualitative risk and opportunity assessment on 15 of our office locations around the world. So we too don't have a huge budget to do this. So we wanted to start small and see, what offices we had the biggest footprint, both from the greenhouse gas emission perspective, the energy perspective, and the people perspective. So we started there. We did a physical risk assessment on those offices. We then spoke with the local facility managers and said, okay, are these risks, how do we validate these risks? Are these risks that you faced in the past? How are you adapting to these risks? And some of them were extreme cold or extreme heat or wildfires. And so I can speak from experience that in California last year when we had the heat wave, the wildfires, and COVID. I live in Oakland, California. I don't have air conditioning. And I had trouble breathing. I have an underlying condition of asthma and was sent to the ER because of that. So these are impacts that are affecting employees and staff and productivity, which ultimately affects revenue and the triple bottom line for companies. And I am a very privileged person. So I have the ability to go to my parents' house, which is 2 hours south. But for the folks that are working from home or in the field who don't have the resources or ability to get cooling or go to a shady area. We really want to focus on that aspect of our employees' health and safety. So we also disclosed to SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. We got our greenhouse gas emissions target approved by the Science Based Target Initiative. And we have committed to a percentage of clean revenue. So green, clean, sustainable revenue for our company. So that has been our trajectory. Again, we are a large multinational global company, but we have a small sustainability budget. So we've been really nimble about what we've been able to do and really creative. So if you have any questions, now is the time to ask those questions, because we are all in this together. We are here to help you. We are here to guide, to answer any questions you might have, share things that we've done that didn't work or did work. So please ask away.
Excellent. Very thorough, Emily and Sue. While we leave it open for Q&A, I know Carol's been asking some questions internally, and I certainly have written some down. But I want to take it to a more basic level in terms of what can companies do today to make themselves more climate ready.
Sure. Sue, I can take that, and then you can pepper in. So what can companies do today? I mean, it really depends on what are your drivers? So are you driven by being a company that wants to be more sustainable and resilient? Are you a company that has partners or prime contractors asking you what your policy is around sustainability and climate change? Are you concerned about regulatory changes and want to get ahead of it? So it really, I think asking those key questions of what's your key driver for becoming more climate ready would be the first question that I would ask. What you can do about it is really thinking about, our first suggestion is to do a light materiality assessment. So bring together a couple of different stakeholders internally and externally. You could bring them to the table, ask them, when it comes to climate change or when it comes to sustainability, what are the topics that are most material or impactful for me as my company? So if it's social equity, that could be a top area and a topic that you really want to hone in on. Is it reducing our greenhouse gas emissions? Is it becoming more resilient for our supply chain, because our supplies and materials that we depend upon are at risk from different physical climate impacts? So really looking at what those topics are that mean the most to you as a company is where I would suggest starting. But Sue, would love your thoughts too.
No, I mean, I think that approach definitely makes sense. Yeah, identifying key drivers, and then you can plan after that once you understand really what your drivers and your objectives are.
And some companies really start with setting out a commitment from their CEO or president of the company saying we are committed to being more sustainable and resilient. And that in itself is a big step, because that you can hang things on, right? You can say our president is committed to this, our workforce is committed to this, and this means a lot to our partners and would open us up to different opportunities in the market. So if you have a commitment from leadership, you can then create a policy that hits on those topical areas that are of most important to you, and go from there. And really, it is a journey. It's not going to happen overnight. And as much as you can include stakeholders that are instrumental to your success, that in itself will open up a lot of different perspectives, but also show that you are collaborating. And as it says on the slide, we're all in this together. So none of us can do this alone. And the more that we collaborate and share, the better our future will be.
And I just wanted to note with the poll that we did about whether clients were asking about climate-related services, it looks like 38% said yes and 54% said no. So maybe it's also educating your clients.
Great. I'll keep going. Sue, when you talked about the octopus in the parking garage and whatnot, I was struck by people who do storm drain design, for instance. You know, the 100-year event used to be the end all. Are those standards going to be changing now because of impacts to climate change? It sounds like a 100-year event's happening, you know, every couple of years now.
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point. What used to be the 100-year event is no longer the 100-year event. And, you know, what is the 100-year event is getting more intense. So it is definitely necessary to rethink those kinds of design standards. And I think, Emily, maybe you can fill in a little bit on this, but my understanding is that it sort of varies where you look around the country, whether or not those standards are being considered. I think California is fairly forward-looking on this. Other states, maybe not so much. So that's, you know, where you look, the regulatory environment may be different, but if you are thinking about designing something that's going to be resilient, certainly you want to be designing it with that kind of changing climate in mind. Emily,
Yeah,
please feel free to
No, you're
add.
exactly right, Sue, and it is really place-based. Unfortunately, the design standards nationally or globally have not yet been updated to reflect future projections of climate change. We're hoping that that will change relatively soon, but you know, we work with a lot of water utilities, and they're going above and beyond the typical design standards to really think about how climate change is going to be impacting their infrastructure so that they can design for the future and not for the past. We also work with a lot of IT and infrastructure companies who are designing data centers that will last for, you know, hopefully 40 to 80 years. So how do they think about what, how adaptive that infrastructure will be to increase flooding or wildfires or extreme heat? And how do they think about that from not only the built infrastructure perspective, but natural infrastructure and social infrastructure? So how does that infrastructure actually support a community thriving in the face of uncertainty? So there are a lot of different standards that do need to be updated, and we're a little bit behind the game on that. But great question, Raul.
So I'm going to combine a question I have and a question that Carol asked. It has to do with working with WSP. So what does your group, or who does your group sub-consult with? What type of or do you, I guess is the first question. And if you do, are we looking to add firms that are, you know, more climate ready? Is that going to be a criteria for us as we add on subs, so that people should start thinking about that if they prefer to work with WSP?
That is an excellent question. And we are, so our team is the in-house kind of corporate sustainability and resilience shop. And so we help WSP Global itself become more sustainable, as well as other corporations. So we have been in deep discussions about developing a screening tool, leveraging our program that's called Future Ready. So Future Ready has 4 different elements. It includes looking at climate change, social issues, technological changes, and resource constraints. So within that, climate change is embedded. And we want to make sure that we are partnering with other firms, if you're a sub, that are thinking about climate change proactively, because you're going to be in our supply chain. You're going to be part of our supply and value chain. We also want to make sure that the projects that we are investing in, whether it become, you know, our time from our staff, or the projects that we go after with different clients, that they are not contributing to more greenhouse gas emissions, but instead we are serving to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, help them become more sustainable and resilient. So we're really looking at developing a screening tool to do just that, to in order to select projects, whether it's process of a go, no go effort to say, will this project create a more sustainable and just resilient future? If not, it gets down on the list. And we're lucky enough to be in that position because the field and the market is just booming right now when it comes to wanting, our clients want more and more of our services, of our time, of our design engineers, of our construction engineers. And they, and so we're at a point where we can say, if you're not, ready for a sustainable future, we would love to get you there if that is something that you're committed to. But yeah, so hopefully that's a long-winded answer to your question. Sir, do you want to add anything?
I think, one thing that struck me when you were speaking was just, when we think about our TCFD alignment, part of our TCFD alignment includes our value chain. So as we think about aligning ourselves, that means sort of aligning all our suppliers, and our clients as well. So.
Exactly.
So we got a couple more minutes. I'm not seeing any from the outside, but I certainly have a ton of questions. And I'll make this the last one before we wrap it up. The question has to do with funding. It sounds like, if it's not already happening, that financial institutions are going to be linking a company's, call it climate readiness, to funding, to loans, to whatever it is it takes to run business. Is that a fair statement? And should people be getting themselves ready for that?
I do believe so. I think, it's illustrative of the sustainability linked loan that we signed. There are more incentives for investors, of shareholders, of folks that are providing funding to companies to make sure that they are climate ready, because that's a risk for them. If they work with a company that has not thought about this or is not committed to becoming more sustainable, that is thus a risk to the financial funder or investor. So they are certainly looking at which companies are sustainable, which ones are resilient. And on one of Sue's slides, there was a note about avoiding greenwashing. So we have been seeing an uptick in the companies that are just checking the box. And so we want to avoid that. And if that means it takes you longer to get there because you're intentional and strategic about it, that's fine. And if you don't have the resources to become more climate ready or sustainable, reach out to the companies that want your services and say, look, how can you help me do this? Have you done this? How have you done this? So, you have the ability to ask the questions and to really say, okay, if this is something that you want me to invest in, can we partner? Can we do this collaboratively?
Awesome. So Emily, if you could advance to the last slide, I'll close us out. I'd like to thank Emily and Sue. Very thorough presentation on a topic that's up and coming, if not already in our faces. Thank you to everyone who's participated today. Reminder, this is a monthly event. Next month's workshop is scheduled for November 11th, 2020. It's typically our second Thursday of the month. And the topic for that, hopefully, will be very timely: federal funding, future infrastructure funding, and impact on transportation, given what's going on at the federal level. Hopefully, we'll have some decisions that have been made by then, and we can talk more about what's happening in our industry related to that. Final reminder that this has been recorded, and the recording of this event and the previous workshops will be made available on the website referenced earlier in the discussion.
I also, sorry, Raul. I also wanted to encourage people to put on their calendar. The Mentor Protege workshops are the second Thursday of every month. So there's always a new exciting topic. And thank you so much to our presenters today. It was really amazing. And you can find that on the diversitybusinessforum.com website, which is in your link right now. Go to past events and you will find recordings and presentations of past workshops, and won't be very long before this one will be up there as well. And we will send you a link to the slides for those of you who registered. And our next Diversity Business Forum is going to highlight Bechtel. That's an engineering, construction, and project management team. And these forums are every second Tuesday of the month. So that'll be November 9th. There's a registration listed there. I hope you get involved. These are great resources. The forum gives you look-aheads and also information about how to work with VTA BART Phase 2, which is almost a $7 billion project with lots of opportunities for small businesses and disadvantaged businesses. If you have any questions, Olga Medina is the manager of the Office of Business Diversity with VTA. You can also contact me. I'll put my email in the chat, and we're just so happy you were here, and spread the word and share the link once you get it.
Thanks for closing us out, Carol. Thanks, everybody, once again. Thanks, Emily and Sue, and we'll see you all next month, we hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.